Mind control is real. It doesn't always look like the stuff of science fiction, though. Hypnosis, microchips, shadowy organizations puppeteering your every move. No. The most effective forms of mind control are much more subtle, and they work. You and I, we are both incredibly easy to influence. And that's not an insult, that's just a part of being a human. But there are people out there who know this, and they frequently exploit it. I've been manipulated before, you've been manipulated before, and at the time of it happening, we likely have no idea that it's going on. But once you become aware of it, you start to see patterns everywhere. We are constantly being propagandized. So let's talk about how it works. Hi folks, I'm Paul, and this is my take. When you hear the word propaganda, it probably carries a negative connotation. If someone labels a piece of media or art as propaganda, most of us almost always instinctively assume that it's deceptive or manipulative or malicious. By definition, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Now, having a bias isn't inherently bad. You have a bias. I have a bias. We all see the world through our own unique perspectives. That's fine. Even presenting news or storytelling with a bias is perfectly normal and fine as long as we're upfront about that bias, as long as we're honest about it. The real problem is when that bias is hidden, when an agenda masquerades as a neutral truth. That's when things can become propagandistic. And it can get kind of dangerous. Now, I wanted to talk about this topic because recently Netflix released a show called Adolescence, and it has sparked a massive conversation. Now, full disclosure, I haven't watched the series, and I don't intend on doing so because I've read enough about the synopsis, I've seen enough of the clips, I know enough about the message and the real-world context to recognize it for what it is: propaganda. For those unfamiliar, Adolescence follows the story of a 13-year-old British boy who stabs and kills a female classmate at his school. The series then explores why a 13-year-old boy would do something like this, ultimately blaming the influence of the online Redpill movement. Figures like Andrew Tate or other so-called manosphere influencers. The show is also receiving a lot of acclaim for its artistic choices, mainly having each of its 4 episodes filmed and edited to look like one continuous shot. But the message of Adolescence is clear. Young boys are becoming violent because of online male-dominated spaces. But is this true, or is it a distraction? The Red Pill movement is a controversial online space. It critiques feminism and the shifting dynamics between men and women. While I personally don't align with the more extreme figures of the manosphere, I do acknowledge that the movement correctly identifies certain societal problems, before often prescribing misguided solutions. To summarize one of their core arguments, and I'll probably do this poorly, essentially, Western society has systematically disadvantaged men in order to elevate women. And this has led to tension between the sexes, particularly in the areas of dating and marriage. Feminism has encouraged things like promiscuity and the erosion of the institution of marriage, making long-term commitment extremely risky, especially for men. And the Red Pill's response? View women as mostly untrustworthy and only valuable in a sexual context. Completely avoid marriage and focus solely on personal success. Now, there's nothing wrong with focusing on personal success, but viewing women as a commodity doesn't help with gender relations. And while I disagree with a lot of the conclusions of the manosphere, one thing is clear. The manosphere is not an inherently violent movement. And this is where Adolescence veers into propaganda. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Why was this series made? The UK is experiencing a knife crime crisis. This is indisputable. And simultaneously, the Red Pill movement has grown in popularity. But correlation does not equal causation. That's what people say, right? The real question is, what is actually driving the rise in knife crime within the UK? Here's where the show's narrative falls apart. If you've been paying attention to the news, you might recall a real-life case of a boy in the UK stabbing multiple girls at his school. This shocking incident made headlines. It was an international story. But the perpetrator looked nothing like this kid. The real-life attacker was Rwandan or Nigerian. Or actually, you know what? It doesn't matter. He wasn't British. And he wasn't influenced by online content. He was a child of an immigrant from a completely different cultural background. In fact, if you look at the vast majority of mugshots of these knife-wielding criminals from the UK, a pattern starts to emerge. The vast majority of them are not British. They might have a piece of paper that says they're British, but they're not. They come from non-Western cultures, non-Western societies that have vastly different values. Maybe you heard about the Rotherham scandal a few months ago. It's an absolutely shocking bit of news that came out of the UK about a rape gang of Pakistani immigrants that targeted primarily white native Brits, almost all of who were minors. And this gang operated for over 20 years with the authorities' knowledge of it happening, but with no motivation to actually do anything about it, essentially out of fear of being called racist. These problems didn't begin with the rise of the Redpill movement. It started with mass immigration from societies that don't share Western norms. And it's pretty obvious. But you can't say that because it would be offensive or something. Instead, the media needed a politically acceptable scapegoat, and they've chosen the Red Pill movement and given it the face of a 13-year-old white boy, who in reality is not doing the stabbing, and we all know this. The brilliance, though, of Adolescence isn't in its accuracy, but in its emotional manipulation. The show's primary audience is white middle-class women, who are led to believe that young middle-class white men are being manipulated and radicalized online by the Red Pill movement. Ironically, though, these women are also being manipulated and radicalized online, just not by the Red Pill movement, but by Netflix instead. But why does this work? Because propaganda isn't about facts, it's about feelings. You've undoubtedly heard the phrase, "your feelings are valid." And this utterance is often incorrect. Your feelings aren't always valid. Sometimes you react in very irrational ways emotionally. Sometimes your feelings are uncalled for. Your feelings aren't always valid, but they are always real. When someone wants to persuade you of something that might not be entirely true, they start by making you feel a certain way. Once you experience an emotional response, once you feel real emotion, you almost instinctively search for an explanation as to why you are feeling that way. And you do this consciously or subconsciously. And if they are there to provide you with an answer, with an explanation as to why you're feeling this way, you'll often accept it, regardless of whether or not it's factual. That's why propaganda is so effective. It doesn't need to be true, it just needs to feel true. You couple that with the series' technical success, with its impressive one-shot editing, and you've got some great propaganda, even if it's blatant. I recently finished reading The Engineering of Consent by Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations. This essay is a masterclass in propaganda. Bernays understood that people aren't driven by logic, facts, or statistics. They are driven by emotions, by unconscious fears and desires and aspirations. If you're interested in these kinds of mind games, I highly recommend giving it a read. Good luck finding a hard copy, though. Printed versions are rare. Oh, here's a fun fact. One of Netflix's founders, Mark Randolph, is actually the great-nephew of Edward Bernays. It's kind of a weird coincidence, isn't it? But this is why left-wing propaganda has been so effective over the last 80 years, is because they understand this. Generally speaking, conservatives prefer facts, data, logical arguments, and they believe that presenting people with statistics is gonna change their mind. But that's not how persuasion works. Right-wing propaganda says, here's a bunch of data, and here's how you should feel about that. Whereas left-wing propaganda says, here's a bunch of feelings, now here is some data to explain why you're feeling that way. Do you see the difference? One approach is cold and analytical right from the beginning, where the other is emotional, engaging. It's deeply effective. If you want to convince someone of something, make them feel before they think. At the end of the day, propaganda serves a purpose. In this particular case, it protects the powerful, the government. The government that is systematically replacing the native population of Brits. In the case of Adolescence, The reality of the UK's knife crime crisis could no longer be concealed, but the truth behind it could still be hidden. If people realized the real reason behind this spike in knife crime, they would be angry at the wrong people, namely the people in power. So instead, they needed a different target for which to direct that anger. And that's where the Red Pill movement comes in, which is already an adversary of those in power. That's kind of convenient, isn't it? Anyway, that's all I've got for today. But what do you think? Have you seen Adolescence and were you convinced by it? What other kinds of propaganda tactics have you noticed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your take. As always, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Hope you're all having a fantastic day, and I will see y'all next time.